My name is Pauly Sias. I am a Kluane First Nation citizen. I spent my entire life in the Kluane region, and I grew up off-grid, what they call Silver City on the south end of Kluane Lake. My grandparents, my parents, my brother and I all had a homestead at the very end of the road there. So I grew up in a unique situation and right beside a ghost town. That really is what Silver City is formally is the ghost town itself, not my family's homestead. It's a little known piece of history for Kluane, I think, like the old town itself. It's not really advertised anymore or talked about, and it is, it's quite old. The buildings are falling in now, but there's tons of history associated with it. And because I grew up right beside it, I think that my grandmother and my family gave me lots of opportunity to learn more about the old town and different periods of use. And so I love to share that with people now because it's so significant to the history of Kluane. And let me tell you the story. It goes back quite some time. So many people will have already heard about the big gold rush, striking it rich, everyone heading to the Yukon in the late 1800s. A lot of people flooded north to try and find gold, and they were heading to Dawson. Dawson was the place where the big gold rush was happening. So I think that's really well-known piece of Yukon history, but little known to that is the idea that Kluane, this area, had its own gold rush. It was not nearly as big as the Dawson fields for sure, but by the time a lot of the people who were coming to try and find gold in Dawson, they got this way to Whitehorse. Like it took a long time to get there, I understand. And so by the time some got there, they were a little late to the game, and gold was running out in Dawson, and they had come all this way. So people like my great grandfather, Louis Jacko, he was one of those folks. He had come, across the States. He's originally from France. But him and his brother Eugene had traveled. They were adventurers and looking for a different life. And so anyhow, they had a long journey to make their way to the Yukon. And by the time that they got to Dawson, it was Louis who came first. And I understand that he heard, like everybody else at the time, the gold was running out. There wasn't many claims left to take. So he was looking for other alternatives. And the way my grandmother explained it was, somewhere in Whitehorse probably, that he heard about this place called Kluane. And at that time, Kluane country in the interior of the Yukon had not really been explored, really. It was kind of untouched. There was a handful of outside people, Europeans and others maybe, who came here just by the few, but didn't stay. So there was a First Nation path, really. It was just First Nations people living in the area. They're semi-nomadic or nomadic lifestyle. And so there was trails, a network of trails that you could follow to get to Kluane, but it was the path less traveled. So anyhow, long story short is, people like my great-grandfather Louis and others took the chance, and they followed this trail from what's Whitehorse out to the south end of Kluane Lake. And that's where you see, beautiful, huge water of Kluane Lake and the mountains surrounding it. And it's kind of a natural place just to camp, really, because once you get there, I can imagine thinking about how you're going to cross that big water or the mountains and where you're going to go. So at the time, there was no infrastructure. They just arrived at this place, and they started looking for gold, and they found gold. So there was quite a few deposits of gold. I don't know if they're laying on the surface or how hard they had to look, but they were found, I believe, mostly in what's now the national park. So around Bullion Creek and Vulcan Creek and in the Aichu Valley, which is all now Kluane National Park. But of course, at the time, it wasn't. It was just open landscape. So, they shared that news however they did, without internet and cell service at the time. But the Moccasin Telegraph, as my grandmother said, was really effective. So word spread pretty quickly overnight that there was gold to be had in Kluane. So this was 1902 was when people started to divert their path from going to Dawson and trying to find gold there. There was people who started to come out to Kluane country, and almost overnight, 2,000 people, outsiders not familiar with the area, flooded to the south end of Kluane Lake, and they needed infrastructure. They needed places to live, and they needed They needed to get themselves set up. A lot of equipment was coming in, so there was an effort to expand what was the walking trail, the First Nations footpath that originally people followed to get to Kluane. They made that into a wagon road. So that was a pretty, very significant add-on for the Kluane area, I guess, at the time, because like I said, there was no trail, or there was nothing but trails before that. So creating this like road, it wasn't a highway, but it was easier access. So people would come with horse and buggy and bring all their equipment out. And they started building log cabins and made this settlement. At the time, the settlement was called the community of Kluane. That was its name. And like I said, there was about 2,000 people there in its heyday, which is incredible to think about, because the population of the Kluane area has never been that in my lifetime, but it was back in 1902. So it's kind of a familiar story in some ways too, that when you find gold, everybody's excited and everybody wants to strike it rich. And so a lot of investment came with the 2,000 people. They put in RCMP dispatch, a mining recorder, a post office. They even had a doctor in the town. It was pretty incredible operation when you think about it. And it was, to get to the gold from where the town site was built, you still needed to cross over Kluane Lake. You needed somehow to get into the valley where the gold was being found. So my great-grandfather Louis, and maybe others, but definitely I know he was one of the ones that was crucial in providing transport. He'd take people from the community of Kluane. He'd lead them to Christmas Bay, which is not far, where he'd take them by barge or on his boat with all of their mining equipment. And imagine some of those stories, and and truck everybody across the lake. So he provided really valuable transportation. But like I said, like so many of the stories, it was rich with gold fields until it wasn't. So the town itself was, the original use, it was only 2 years, it's my understanding, where there was that kind of population of like 2,000 people living there. And then after all of this investment and building this infrastructure, and then eventually ultimately running out of the gold in that location, it was no longer easy to find. So many people decided to pack up and leave at that time. But they left a footprint, which is really like one of the key things in my mind to the history of this site, is that it was the very first built up infrastructure in Kluane. Traditionally before that, First Nations people who were living here were not building like permanent homes and settling in one location. You followed your food and you moved with the seasons. You lived in different kind of simpler brush hut structures. And so this was quite significant to actually have like log cabins permanently built. And even true to today, right? If you build a cabin in the woods in the Yukon, I think if you abandon it, somebody else is bound to take it over. Good building is a good building. So that's part of the history of that community, is like multi-uses over different generations. The gold fields, the Kluane Gold Rush is what they call that time period, in 1902 to 1904, when the community was built. But many people left. My great-grandfather Louis stayed, and a few others did as well, and I think just kind of carved out a life for themselves in this beautiful country. But it left also a lot of vacant buildings. So I think that, without getting too much into the dates and specific names of people, I understand that, it became more of like a family kind of homestead. A couple families like took over some of those buildings, started to grow big gardens and just provide a life for themselves. It was also an introduction to the idea of agriculture and growing your food instead of following your food, like my great-grandmother Mary would say. From a First Nation point of view, you used to follow your food and go where the food was. The idea of planting a garden and growing your vegetables in one spot close to where you live was around that time period introduced, through outsiders coming with that knowledge and seeds. And so another really important introduction for Kluane. And then, it shifted names and uses later on, and I don't remember the exact dates. I feel like I want to say sometime in the 30s. The site became used to raise foxes, and silver foxes in particular. So they were live captured from the wilderness in the Yukon, and they were raised in captivity, and they were raised for sure for their pelts. There was a valuable market, and European market at the time, who was paying quite highly for that kind of furs. And it was a lucrative economy for not just that place, but other places in the Yukon as well. People used to have fox farms. So that's when the name changed officially, like from the community of Kluane, it became known as Silver City. And I think that's another really important piece, because a lot of people will think Silver City it's often like there's many silver cities in the world, and many of them are named after silver mining. But this one is unique in that way because it's actually after the silver foxes. So, when I was a kid, much of the old town was still standing, and those fox pens were in great shape, and you really got a sense of like how many foxes would have been raised in the town site. And also, smaller pens for mink and marten. So they did raise more than just foxes, but that's the significance of the name Silver City. And then that, the whole economy of raising furs in that way, live capturing and raising, in captivity animals for their pelts, that was abolished in the early 40s. So that put an end to that economy and that use of Silver City town site. So again, there was a shift there. It kind of died off. The next use of it really came shortly after that with the U.S. Army and building of the Alaska Highway. And that took place in like 1942. It was World War II. There was a major push by the United States really to connect Alaska to the mainland really. So they felt like Alaska was quite vulnerable, I understand. And it was wartime, so there was urgency behind it. And the Alaska Highway was an incredible feat of engineering with like 8 months being built and from start to finish kind of thing. And there were different regiments that were deployed throughout different areas. One landed in Whitehorse and were given their directions to build this highway and connect with the other parties that were starting in Alaska and Dawson's Creek. And anyhow, a little bit of a leg up for the troops that came to Whitehorse, because they had this wagon road at least. There was a wagon road, like I said, that connected Whitehorse to Silver City. So they followed that, and that, the original Alaska Highway was very much in line with that old wagon road. But they kind of, imagine they got to Silver City just similar to someone like my great-grandfather way back then, that you arrive and it's such a big lake and it's, it's big water and it's big mountains and there's no wagon road past this point. And there's all these buildings. There's all these empty buildings, mostly empty. So they used Silver City and the old town site as base camp. They put up a few more buildings. They had thousands of workers with them. So they actually did build like mess halls and cookhouses and bunkhouses. They stayed quite some time in the old town site because they were trying to figure out a way to build the highway around this big lake, right? So it was an interesting time, another period of use that, Silver City was an important place for people, and that the Alaska Highway workers, the ones who were stationed here, it took some time for them to figure out how to get around the lake. So I understand through my grandmother that it was about 3 months that those workers actually stayed at Silver City. And you can find old pictures of big band. They had their 4th of July party there, and they spent quite a bit of time. So it was part of the important piece of history for that town site. And after that point, I think that there was only a couple families maybe that remained kind of in the area. And they were, just living independently and utilizing those old houses and growing their food. And a pretty simple life, but it was nowhere near like a community anymore. And things changed drastically for the whole Kluane area after the highway came through. And there were new settlements, Destruction Bay. And Burwash had been there pre-highway. It was actually my great-grandfather Louis was involved with the establishment of that community too, with building a trading post after Silver City. After the mini gold rush that I talked about winded down, then he carved himself a new life, I think locally. And anyhow, that's a whole nother story in itself. But I think it's special because it's not advertised. It's not something that many people know the history of this important old town. It is privately owned property, which is an interesting thing in itself because, back in many, many years ago, I think probably in the 50s or 60s, I understand you could come to the Yukon and kind of just say, well, I like this chunk and put in for it and pay a bit of money, and then it became yours. So that's not the case today, but it is how it was then. So the whole old town site of Silver City itself is privately owned. So I think that also steers the Yukon government and other organizations away from promoting people to go there and promoting interpretation about the site, and which is unfortunate in many ways, only, in my mind, because it is such a integral part of the infrastructure and the introduction to people from outside coming to Kluane country. But we don't get to showcase that so much. So I love to just talk to people about it and share what I know from growing up beside it and running through those fox pens, playing hide and seek with my brother when I was a kid. Really having an appreciation for like those old buildings and all the history that happened there over the years. But it's a very quiet scene today. Most of the buildings are, in bad repair, but it has a sense of like history and what happened there over 100 years ago, and it was really significant. But when I was a kid growing up there, my grandparents bought the property just past the old town site in, I think, 1972. So it wasn't, we weren't Silver City, but, when I was a kid being raised there, we were the only residents on the end of that road. So it became Silver City was our family's homestead. Everyone referred to us at the end of it as going to Silver City, which is kind of cool. But, I definitely grew up knowing that we weren't Silver City. We're just on the edge of it by the shore of Kluane Lake. But the old ghost town itself with all this history, that's Silver City. A really important piece of Kluane history.